overview. Thank you, Susan. Just to reassure everybody, we're recording the teaching parts of this and the meditations, which are going up on the Jamyang Lee's YouTube account. We're not recording discussions, just to reassure everybody. We make sure we switch that off when we get to the discussion part, so you've got some privacy. So things can be quite confidential. But yeah, we're looking at the Buddhist practices of thought transformation, which particularly shows ways of utilising difficult situations of daily life to apply our practice and in a positive way. I gave a little overview last week of the history of thought transformation, and also talked about how it's all about turning around self-centeredness. And I talked a little bit about the two aspects of self-centeredness, which is one is what we call fundamental ignorance, that we grasp at this notion of an I that's much more solid and independent than is really the case, and that creates a false sense of separation between self and other. And I explained that the wisdom side of the teachings really are addressing that, but we're going to come to that later, so don't worry about that. I'll go into that more. And then the other aspect of self-centeredness, which is emphasised more generally in thought transformation practices, is self-cherishing. And that's the mind that's primarily concerned with our own happiness and doesn't care quite so much necessarily about the happiness of others. And again, we're trying to turn that round and to develop the kind of attitude that just wants to help all sentient beings equally, and just in the same way that we very naturally do for ourselves. And that's the idea. So I won't say any more now, it'll sort of make sense as we progress. And we're actually going to start looking today at the 8 verses of thought transformation. Apart from Laura, you should all have a copy of these now. Did everybody get those in the email? Of the 8 verses here. So you have got that to refer to, but don't worry, as we're going through tonight, I'm going to be reading them out. Laura, what I would suggest, we're going to type up our email address in the chat bit. If you click on chat, you'll see. I haven't done it yet because I was waiting until everybody comes in to make sure everybody can get it. Can you just send me a quick email and I can then email those straight to you? And that's the verses we use.
Great, thank
you. Get on with typing that. Yeah, thanks. Now I'm going to swap the order around a bit tonight. We're going to do the meditation first. We looked last week at a meditation called Tong Len. And we're going to revisit that again next week. What I thought we'd do for the meditation today is we're actually going to go through the 8 verses, which we're going to be looking at over the next 2 or 3 weeks. We'll probably only do 2 or 3 of them tonight. But in the meditation, I'm going to slowly read through the 8 verses, and we're going to do a little contemplation in between as a relevant bit. So I'd invite you all to get yourselves comfy. Getting a nice posture for meditation. The most important thing is that you're nice and relaxed and stable. It doesn't matter if you're on a cushion or chair, either's fine. And it's particularly helpful if we can have a nice straight back. And that's without forcing it. One way you can help with that is just imagine that your vertebra is a pile of pound coins stacking one on top of the other, starting at the bottom. And it can also be helpful if you just imagine somebody's tugging very gently at the top of your head, like there's a little bit of string on the top of your head. Just very, very gently stretching your spine just a little bit. And you just relax back into the posture. If at any point during the meditation you feel like you need to stretch your leg or anything like that, just do it. Don't sit there feeling uncomfortable. There's no prizes for just sitting still. The main thing is we're nice and comfy and relaxed. But if you do need to move, just do it mindfully and keep your mind on the meditation. First thing we're going to do, start turning your attention to the natural rhythms of your breathing. Notice the subtle sensations as we breathe in, breathe out. The air enters at that point at the nostrils, goes down through the body, to your lungs, your diaphragm moves down. Again, notice as your diaphragm moves up, pushing the air back out, it goes up again. Out at that point at the nostrils. Just let yourself breathe naturally, don't force it. Again, noticing those subtle sensations. We're actually going to turn our attention to that point at the nostril. Again, noticing those subtle sensations. The air enters your body. Just going to, in a nice relaxed way, keep your attention at that point at the nostrils. Become distracted. Don't worry about it. Just as soon as you notice, just in a nice relaxed way, just place your attention back at that point at the nostril. Don't feed those thoughts or follow them. Wait till later. Just do that quietly to yourself for a couple of minutes. This is a really good way of helping to calm down the mind. Bring our attention more fully into the present moment. Okay, it's always a good way to start any meditation with this kind of practice, what we call calm abiding, placement meditation. Ideally, it'd be good to spend a little longer on this, but we've only got so long. So I'm now going to recite slowly the refuge bodhicitta prayer. You can recite along with me if you like. If you're comfortable with that, there's no obligation. In my heart, I turn to the three jewels of refuge. May I free suffering creatures and place them in place. The compassionate spirit of love grow within me that I might complete the enlightening path. In my heart, I turn to the three jewels of refuge. May I free suffering creatures and place them in place. May the compassionate spirit of love grow within me that I might complete the enlightening path. In my heart, I turn to the three jewels of refuge. May I free suffering creatures and place them. May the compassionate spirit of love grow with me, so I might complete the enlightening path. A really important part of this prayer is setting our motivation. Good to have a really good positive motivation before we engage with any activity. Best kind of motivation we can have is bodhicitta. That's the altruistic intention based on great compassion for all living beings. To work on transforming our mind towards full enlightenment, so we can be in the best possible position to be able to benefit everybody. Try and set a really positive motivation for the practice we're about to do on the 8 verses. The rest of this session, and ideally for your life as a whole. I think we're not just doing this to benefit ourselves, although that's an important part of it. You matter as much as everyone else. But also to put us in a better position to be able to truly benefit us. Now I'm slowly going to read through the 8 verses. We'll pause after each one and do a little reflection. This is verse 1. With the thought of attaining enlightenment for the welfare of all beings who are more precious than wish-fulfilling jewels, I will constantly practice holding them dear. Again, this verse refers to bodhicitta, which I've just explained, the altruistic intention to become enlightened so we can be the most beneficial sentient being. This is based on feeling great compassion for all living beings without exception. Holding them dear, seeing them as more precious than wish-fulfilling jewels, as it says in the verse. One reason other sentient beings are so precious is without them we'd have no opportunity to develop ourselves spiritually, to develop qualities like generosity, love, patience, passion, and so on. It's also good here, and I encourage people to think about this during the week, to reflect on all the different ways that we're interdependent with other beings. Everything we have, everything we are, one way or another, is dependent on other sentient beings. Our existence in this life, our body, all the possessions we have. Also our mind, our education, our emotional well-being, stability, all of these things are actually dependent on others to some extent. Constantly affecting and influencing each other in all our daily interactions. Discuss this later, but there's so many ways and all sorts of levels of subtlety. We're actually interdependent with other sentient beings. Working to benefit everyone really is. It does make sense. In the long term, it's also the best way to benefit ourselves. Part of everyone. Okay, now verse 2. Whenever I'm with others, I will practice seeing myself as the lowest of all. and from the very depths of my heart, I will hold others dear and supreme. Now, this verse is particularly encouraging humility as an antidote to egocentric pride. Again, we'll be discussing. But it's also a powerful way, and this is part and parcel of that, to counteract our tendency to find fault in others, criticise them, perhaps notice their good qualities. But perhaps sometimes to gloss over our own shortcomings. Let's resolve to try and be more inclined to see to really see and appreciate, take joy in other people's good quality. To be more honest sometimes about our own shortcomings. Now, verse 3, in all actions, I will examine my mind. The moment a delusion arises, endangering myself and others, I will confront and avert it without delay. This verse is really encouraging mindfulness, which is a very, very important quality. Mindfulness is being aware of what we're doing at any given moment in time. That's all our actions of body and speech. But also particularly important, what's going on within our mind. Now, when we notice things like anger or jealousy arising in our mind, as soon as we notice, again, being gentle and realistic, which is something I talked about a bit last week. Do everything we can to reduce these things. Because even if they're not manifesting on the surface really obviously to others right now, as long as these things are within our mind through cause and effect, they'll lead to problems sooner or later. Ourselves and others. And it is also good to be mindful of positive qualities as well within our minds. Things like love and patience are arising. To take joy in those things. To do everything we can to nurture and develop. Now, verse 4. Whenever I meet a person of bad nature who is overwhelmed by negative energy and intense suffering, I will hold such a rare one dear, as if I had found a precious treasure. We're really encouraged in Buddhism, if we can, to when we encounter people who we find difficult, seem to have a lot of negative energy, to think of these people like our teachers. I mean, it's not very difficult to have positive feelings towards people who are kind and good-natured towards us. People we find difficult actually giving us really good opportunities to apply our practice. To really put our patience and love to the test. And we resolve to try and do that wherever we can. Again, being realistic, this is a gradual process. To try and utilise situations like that in a positive way. Now, verse 5. When others out of jealousy, mistreat me with abuse, slander, and scorn. I will practice accepting defeat and offering the victory to them. Now, somebody criticises us, it could be to our face or behind our back. Try not to just angrily defend ourselves, or perhaps do or say something negative back. But, instead, we really try and take responsibility for this situation, particularly think, I'm sure we can think of instances when we've criticised others harshly, fairly. Again, we can utilise situations like this to really strengthen our resolve to try and reduce those kinds of behaviours in ourselves, so we don't contribute to disharmony amongst people. So, try to speak kindly, positively about others. Well, in some circumstances, it's right to talk things through with the person. That can help, as long as we do it patiently and kindly, not motivated by anger or a need just to sort of justify ourselves or anything like that. But sometimes that won't work, and if it doesn't work, just let the thing go. Don't harbour it. Don't cling to this thing of wanting to prove yourself right. Sometimes it's better just to let things go. It's good wherever we can to listen with no minded criticism. I mean, sometimes there might be something in it, sometimes not. But we can always learn something from it, and particularly from the way we react to it. Again, it gives us a good opportunity to overcome self-centeredness, which, as we looked at last week, is the root of our own problem, as well as limiting our ability to help others. Now, verse 6. When someone I've benefited and in whom I've placed trust hurts me very badly, I will practice seeing that person as my supreme teacher. I mean, particularly when we help others, quite often we expect them to be grateful or thank us or be kind back. That isn't always the case. And it can be quite difficult sometimes if we feel we've helped them, they still don't treat us very nicely. But again, these kinds of situations really help us to test how pure our motivation is. We try to do things simply because it's the right thing to do within our overall aims and practices, not just expecting short-term reward or results. Verse 7. In short, I will offer directly and indirectly every benefit and happiness to all beings, my mothers. I will practice in secret, taking upon myself all their harmful actions and suffering. Now, this is really getting at the practice of Tonglen, or taking and giving, which we looked at last week. But this is the kind of attitude we're trying to adopt in our daily lives. It's not just when we're meditating. And the real essence of thought transformation, which is our subject overall, is exchanging self and others. Replacing the attitude of cherishing oneself with the attitude that cherishes everybody, just as much as we quite naturally do ourselves. And often we work on making ourselves happy, not necessarily thinking too much about others, sometimes even if it's at the expense of others. But here we're really trying to reverse our priorities. Just trying to give happiness to others, and to be willing to take on their problems and difficulties. It says in that verse, I will practice in secret. And the reason for that is we don't do this just to be seen by others. It's, again, this comes down to our motivation. It's more of a change of our inner attitude. People might not be aware at all that we're doing this. It's not why we're doing it, to impress others. Verse 8, just the final. Through perceiving all phenomena as illusory, I will keep these practices. Undefiled by the stains of the 8 worldly concerns, and free from clinging, I will release all beings from the bondage of disturbing, unsubdued mind and karma. Now, it talks here about our practices being undefiled by the stains of the 8 worldly concerns, and they're sometimes called the 8 worldly dharmas. These are attachment to pleasure, praise, gain and fame, reversion to pain, criticism, loss and notoriety. As long as these things are predominant in our mind, they'll tend to contaminate even our positive actions. We try to be wary of these. Again, being gentle and realistic. Wherever we spot these things, to do what we can to reduce them. And again, to practice as purely as we possibly can. Not just looking for short-term, egocentric kind of rules. And it says at the start of that verse, through perceiving all phenomena as illusory. Now, this is really getting at something I talked about last week. I talked about selflessness and emptiness. Phenomena are said to, they're not just illusions. That's quite important, but they're illusory-like in that they appear to exist one way when they actually exist in another. Things appear to us to exist more independently and separately than is the case. This applies to external phenomena, and it very much applies to our notions of self as well, which again I talked about. None of these things exist as independently, as inherently, as independently of positive conditions. Everything exists interdependently within the flow of cause and effect, which we're all a part. The more we're able to apply the wisdom side of the teachings on selfless and empty, live in accord with this selfless and interdependent nature, which we're all a part. This enables us to engage with all our practices really purely. Selflessly motivated. Okay, finally, we'll conclude the meditation. Just a little dedication. Just let's think that any benefit that's come from the effort doing the practice contribute with all the subtle workings of cause and effect to the long-term benefit of all the. Okay. Right, in that meditation, I went through all the 8 verses, I mean, it's interesting that, as I explained last week, these were actually written in the 11th century by a quite well-known practitioner called Langri Tampa, who came just a generation or so after the teacher who I mentioned as well. That's one of the Indian masters that originally helped to bring the teaching about. And for the kind of situations that it encourages to address, I think for every bit as relevant today, as, you know, modern life as they were, you know, for a monk in the 11th century. As I tried to get across last week, I mean, it's very, very practical stuff, this. And I'm just going to talk a little bit now about the first couple of verses. I think I might get to verse 3 tonight, so then we'll have some discussion based on that. I'm going to go back to verse 1 again. And I went through some of this in the meditation. I'll just read that out. So this is with the thought of attaining enlightenment for the welfare of all beings who are more precious than wish-fulfilling jewels. I will constantly practice holding them dear. As I said at the meditation, this is really getting to our motivation for doing all of this, which is bodhicitta, that's altruistic intention to become enlightened, to benefit everybody. And that is based on this attitude that, that, as it says in the verse, really holds sentient beings as dear and more precious than wish-fulfilling jewels. Now, it's before we start with this, particularly in relation to bodhicitta and these practices as a whole, just review the benefits of doing this stuff. That's a really common methodology in Buddhism, and it makes a lot of sense, I think, psychologically. If we're engaging with any kind of positive activity, the more clear we are of the benefits of doing it and why we're doing it, the more likely we are to engage with it enthusiastically. I think that makes sense, doesn't it? Conversely, actually, if we're taking on a negative thing, like anger, for instance, we're often encouraged at the start just to reflect on the disadvantages and shortcomings and the problems that causes. And again, it really strengthens our motivation. So here, if we're going to think about the benefits of bodhicitta and really turning around self-cherishing into this mind that cherishes everybody equally, there are a number of ways we can think about this. One thing that sometimes sticks in my mind that Lama Zopa, who many of you will be familiar with, is the spiritual head of the FBMT, really, sometimes says, is there's only one of me, there are countless others. So why would I live a life that's so limited, that's orientated mainly on me? I think that's quite a nice way of looking at it. And it's a very Lama Zopa thing. His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, sometimes with his usual humour, he refers to bodhicitta as skillful self-cherishing. And he always says it with a little grin. And what he means, self-cherishing generally, the way I've explained it, is seen as a thing we're trying to overcome. But what he's actually saying there is that working for the benefit of everybody really is, in the long run, the best way of benefiting ourselves. But it is something we need to think about this. And one thing I encouraged everybody to think about in the course of the week is to think about that interdependent nature and the way that our lives are so interdependent. Yeah, and there's a number of ways we can reflect on this. For anybody who's familiar with the Lamrim, there's some quite important Lamrim meditations early in the Lamrim on this. Firstly, our very existence in this life, this body, is dependent on our mother and father. That's a given, isn't it? And then we could trace that back to countless beings before them, if we think about it. So that's one way to think about it. Everything we have or own, one way or another, is dependent on others. Clothes we're wearing, the food we eat, the house we're living in, the heating that we're all experiencing. Now, winter's coming on. I mean, all these things are actually dependent on other beings, many of whom we'll never meet. Some of whom, if we did meet them, we might not even feel that close to them or get on that easily with them, but we're still very, very interdependent. We depend on each other all the time. We could also think, I mean, the environment that we occupy is dependent not just on humans, on countless beings, isn't it? To have this kind of habitable environment, and that's a nice way of connecting with the rest of nature as well. You know, obviously very reliant on that. Also, very importantly, it's not just physical things. Drink. It also relates to our mind, our emotions, our emotional stability and things like that. In all sorts of ways are connected with other people and other beings. Again, quite a lot of that could depend on our parents and our family when we're growing up, the kind of education we have. Again, very dependent on others. And in all the kind of daily interactions that we have with other people and other beings, we're actually affecting and influencing people all the time. And I think this is a really, really good thing to reflect on sometimes. One thing I emphasised last week is, due to this self-grasping ignorance that I talked about, and self-cherishing also very much affirms this, we have this false sense of separation between self and other. And from a Buddhist point of view, this is really at the root of our problems. Thinking like this can help to change that. So we live it more in accord with that interdependent flow, if you like, which we're all a part. I think sometimes it can be good thinking about that if we're feeling very powerless as well, actually, which I'm mentioning as a little bit of an aside here. It's quite easy to get caught up with things like, it could be global warming, it could be Brexit, it could be Putin, it could be you know, all kinds of sort of worldly problems. And it's quite easy to get weighed down by these things and feel quite powerless. I would suggest, if we really think about it, even little acts of kindness can actually make quite a big difference in the long term in the overall process of cause and effect. And I think that's something we can take quite a lot of solace from. You know, if we just do our little bit and try and practice as purely as we can and as kindly as we can, you know, in the long run, it really can make a difference. We probably all have the sort of experience. You might have had a rough day, and then you come into contact with somebody who's just very, very friendly and kind to you. It might just be somebody you don't know in a shop or something, and it can suddenly have a really big effect on your mood. In turn, that affects your next interaction with the next person you come into contact, and so on. And you can think like this. There's so much to this, and we are going to be discussing this. But we really are interdependent. You know, but it is really, really good to think and appreciate that, so we can live more in accord with that. That's one way of thinking how working for the benefiting everybody is actually the best way to benefit ourselves as well, you know, which is part and parcel on this. Also, as I said in the meditation, we need other beings to develop ourselves spiritually and to progress towards an enlightenment. It's to develop things like love and compassion and patience. You know, we need other beings, and that's another area, really important way that we're dependent on others. And we're also encouraged, and I brought this into one of the verses. We're going to be looking at this more next week, actually, with difficult people. But people we find difficult and challenging are really, really giving us good opportunities to develop qualities like patience and love and compassion. And the more we understand the benefits of those qualities to our own mind, let alone in terms of affecting our ability to help others, you know, that the more that will encourage us to apply that. You know, it's not always easy, and I don't want to say with any of this, it's sort of, there aren't any glib quick fixes. You know, some of these situations can be really, really challenging. But it does give us the opportunity to imply that, again, gently and realistically, and something I emphasised a lot last week, you know, to do what we can to change things for the better. Another important thing here when we're reflecting on the benefits is to check how we actually feel when we're helping others, as opposed to times when we're very caught up with our own problems and difficulties. And it's good to notice that. That's another good application of mindfulness, to actually notice that and how it makes us feel. And I would suggest that there is that kind of feeling of warmth and calm, you know, stability when we're helping others. And sometimes it can actually be a good way of not getting too wrapped up in our own problems and difficulties. There are all sorts of chances when we can do this. It might be in your profession, work. It could be voluntary work. It could be just helping friends and relatives, sometimes just listening to people, giving them your time. Now, there's all sorts of ways, you know, or it could be helping animals and things as well. There's all sorts of ways we can apply this. And it's really important we draw inspiration from that, you know, to keep us going, because it isn't always easy, and there will be obstacles and there will be difficulties. But if you keep reminding yourselves of that, and you know, it helps us keep plugging away, you know, not get disheartened. I think also sometimes if you spend time with practitioners like Lama Zopa Rinpoche, I'll mention, or His Holiness the Dalai Lama, one of the things that comes across to me is how deeply they really genuinely feel this. They really seem to have this care for everybody. They're really from the depths of their hearts, and it's very, very inspiring, you know, and when you're in the presence of people like that. And you can see, I mean, the benefits of them as well as everybody around them. I mean, you know, and it is good to draw inspiration from that. They don't have to be Buddhists. I mean, you could think of somebody like Desmond Tutu. I think he could be very inspiring. There are lots of others, you know, outside the Buddhist as well. But again, people who really do have that kindness, you know, and that they really care about others, you know, deeply to the bottom of their being, really. And there's just the final thing I'll say on that, which is quite important to remind ourselves of, is that all sentient beings are essentially equal. In the respect that we all want happiness, we want to avoid suffering, but we're not actually necessarily doing the right things to achieve that due to ignorance and the other reflections. And that's a really good self thing to remind ourselves of sometimes. When we do the Tong Len practice again next week, I'll be bringing that into that meditation, but it's a really, really good thing to think about, and particularly with people we find very, very difficult. You know, just think they are still trying to be happy, but perhaps, you know, they don't really understand how to do that and to go about the right way to achieve that. And that's a very good thing to remind ourselves of. Okay, so that's verse 1, as I say, and we are going to be discussing this in a little bit. So I'm going to move on to verse 2 now, and I'll read out this one. Whenever I'm with others, I will practice seeing myself as the lowest of all, and from the very depths of my heart, I will hold others dear and supreme. Now, the first thing I'm going to emphasize, and I know I did bang on about this a lot last week, but we do have to be very careful with this, particularly this phrase, as the lowest of all. This is not about trashing ourselves, and that's really, really important. Something I emphasized a lot last week, that saying of Long Yeshes, is be gentle with yourself and you'll be gentle with others, and it's really, really important that. And if we misuse this or take it out of context, there is a danger. You know, we could cause ourselves problems. This certainly isn't about becoming discouraged or demoralized. Anything but. And as I say, putting ourselves down in that kind of really unhealthy way. I mean, it's actually the opposite. If we do this in the right context with skill and understanding, we can actually develop a kind of joy and confidence in developing bodhicitta. But it's one grounded in wisdom, not drowned in kind of egocentric aims. But that's the thing. But the last thing it's doing is like trashing ourselves or putting us down. But it is about overcoming our tendency towards egocentric pride and developing humility. It's a very big obstacle to spiritual development, egocentric pride. For a start, we can be very, very resistant to wanting to change and grow and learn, you know, if we have a lot of that. And humility is, of course, a very good way of overcoming that. It also makes us much better company for others. One thing I'm going to mention as an aside here, but it is very relevant to this. I was reading something by Venerable Tubden Chodron recently, who's a very respected nun and practitioner, teacher. And she was actually talking about a method in Shantideva as a guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life, which is another method of thought transformation, actually. There's quite a lot of that in that text, which was helping us to overcome our tendencies towards egocentric pride on the one hand and jealousy on the other. And these things are actually linked. We can see how one might feed the other and vice versa, I think, in daily situations. And one thing she said there was that whenever we come into contact with other people, we have to check. We often have this tendency to start ranking ourselves in relation to them. I found when I first read it quite hard to take on board this, but I think it is something, it's really good, again, to be mindful of that. And it can manifest in all sorts of ways, like, oh, I'm clever, or they're cleverer than me. I'm better looking, they're better looking than me. You know, I'm richer. In all sorts of ways, it can manifest that, and it is something to be wary of. And it will tend to lead us one way or the other, either to get too uppity and too proud in relation to, or to be jealous of them. Yeah, it's good to. This verse is particularly using humility to address the tendency towards egocentric pride. It's particularly counteracting. I brought this into the meditation, our tendency to find fault in others and be very, very aware of the faults of others. Perhaps not necessarily to take joy in their good qualities. And perhaps do the opposite with ourselves. You know, to be sort of gloss over our own shortcomings and perhaps big up sometimes too much our own good quality. But it's good to take joy in good qualities. Again, you have to be careful with that. But there's a question of being honest here. What is a really, really good way of counteracting this, though, is taking joy in other people's good qualities. And it is a very, very important practice, that. It's a really good antidote to jealousy, and it's not always easy. I mean, for instance, if it's somebody at work who we work with and they're suddenly getting loads of praise from the boss, and we might feel that they don't deserve it and you've been not noticed or something like that. It can be quite challenging, this. But it's a really, in my experience, what goes around comes around, and probably your turn will come at some point anyway. But it's really, really good just to try and take joy in other people's qualities and in other people's happiness and things like that. As I say, it is a very, very powerful antidote to jealousy. When some of you might be familiar with the 7-limb prayer, which we often recite at the start of teachings and Buddhist practices, and it's actually one of the lines in that, rejoicing in the merits of all holy and ordinary beings, depending on the translation. And that is actually there as a specific antidote to jealousy. So it's a good thing to bear in mind sometimes, that, and take joy. As I say, with other people, things seem to be going well for them. As I've mentioned, this phrase in this verse of I'll see myself as the lowest of all, we do have to be very, very careful with that, and bear in mind the context and the purpose of it. And as I say, it's about developing humility, overcoming egocentric pride, and we have to be skillful and realistic in the way I talked about last week when we apply this. But I would suggest, and again, this is something we can discuss, there are actually quite a lot of situations where we can apply that. If you're in a supermarket queue, for instance, we often in our culture get sucked into this, oh, I'm so busy and my time's precious, so precious kind of way of thinking. But sometimes if you see somebody else look stressed and they look like they're in a big hurry, just let them in or something like that. That's a good example where you could apply this. It could apply when we're out and about driving around in our car. Sometimes just in social situations, just stepping back and spending more time listening to others, giving them room perhaps to talk. That could be an example of this, instead of being so busy perhaps at talking ourselves or promoting ourselves or talking about ourselves. These are just some examples. We can talk about this. But again, we do have to be sensible and realistic in the way we apply that. But humility is a very, very important quality. And as I've said, egocentric pride is often cited as a particularly bad obstacle to spiritual development. So it is something we want to try and be wary of. And then the third verse, which I'm going to mention recently, just quite quickly, because I want to give us lots of time to discuss. Verse 3, again, I'll read it out, which is, in all actions, I will examine my mind. At the moment a delusion arises, endangering myself and others, I will confront and avert it without delay. This is really talking about mindfulness, which again is a really important quality, if we want to progress spiritually. And I brought it into the meditation, but again, I'll explain what we mean by being mindful. It's being aware at any given moment of all our actions. That's the body, speech and mind. So what we're doing physically, what we're saying, and even more importantly, what's going on within our mind. It all starts with the mind before we engage with any kind of speech or physical action. And so all our thoughts and feelings, and actually noticing them as they're arising. It might sound a bit silly, that, but I think if we check, a lot of the time we're kind of on autopilot and we're not actually that aware. And it's really important we make an effort with this sometimes with mindfulness. This is the real key to making our Dharma practical and actually applying it to our daily lives and transforming it. We can study as much as we want, but if we don't notice what we're actually doing from moment to moment, it's not going to have that much effect on transforming our lives and our being. So it's very, very important, mindfulness. And when we catch things like anger or jealousy arising, we can then, for a start, just catching it helps. To give an example, I have to be really careful with this when I'm working with my computer. That can be a trigger for me when I get computer problems, mostly because of my own IT ignorance, I have to say. But it's a time when I have to be quite mindful, because otherwise I can lose my rag quite quickly. But just be mindful, and because I know it's a trigger, I remind myself of that before I sit down to work with my computer. So I'll notice if anger or frustration starts arising, and just noticing it can really be really, really helpful. But there are then specific antidotes we can apply to reduce it. And gradually, if we keep doing that, it changes our habits. I don't fly off the handle when I get computer problems now in the way I used to some years ago. Yeah, so you, and again, you can take some encouragement from that. I still have some way to go with that one, I have to say. But again, we're in this if in the long term. Yeah, and that other people won't have that problem, but you might experience it in other ways, in other areas of your life. So it can be really helpful. And some people have more of a problem with jealousy, and you know. But again, mindfulness is the key to spotting it, and then can actually really do something about it to turn it around. One thing I did think on that, I think some of you know, I came into this at very short notice last week. I've been thinking a little bit of how to do the course over the next few weeks. I'm going to try and keep the last session free, so we can just look at some really practical ways of dealing with things like anger and jealousy. And Buddhist psychology is really, really good with that. It offers all sorts of approaches we can adopt. Some, you know, we're all different. We'll find some more help than others. But I'm going to save that for the last session, and we'll particularly look at dealing anger, talk about how we can apply that to jealousy and other things as well. But there are things we do. We're not stuck with these things. As I mentioned, it's particularly important with our mind this. We might think if it hasn't manifested on the outside through the things we say or things we actually do physically, and other people haven't noticed, we've kind of got away with it. We haven't in the long term. As long as we still have these tendencies within our mind, they're going to cause a problem at some point. Yeah, and they're likely to manifest externally and cause problems with others. So it's really, really important that we do that as vigilantly as we can. And it's very, very specific here in the verse. It's quite strong. I'm also going to talk generally now about what we mean by something being negative or positive, because I think that's quite important. So I've used examples of anger and jealousy as negative things. But the general definition of a negative action from a Buddhist point of view is they're actions that are motivated by afflictions, and that's things like ignorance, self-centered attachment and aversion, that will lead to problems and difficulties for either oneself or others. And that's a negative thing. And he actually says here, it says the moment of delusion arises, endangering myself and others. You know, it makes that point. The definition, conversely, of a positive action, these are the kinds of things like love, compassion, acts of kindness, patience. These things are rooted in wisdom and love and compassion, and they will lead to a reduction of suffering and problems and difficulties, to increase in the well-being and happiness of oneself and others. That's the broad definition. And when we talk about being mindful, it's not just with the negative stuff. That's what's particularly emphasized here, and it is important, so we can do what we can to uproot those things and reduce them. But it's also good to be mindful of positive things as well. That could be actions, it could be words, but particularly what's going on in our mind. And to take joy, you know, if we're having feelings of love and compassion for others, it's good to notice that. And because those things, we don't want to reduce those things, we want to nurture and develop them. And again, I just thought I'd finish that one on a positive note, because it's particularly talking about mindful negative behaviours in the verse, but it is equally important that we do notice and take joy in the positive stuff as well. And that will encourage us to keep persevering, and particularly when problems and obstacles arise. Okay, I think that's enough chit chat from me. I'm going to encourage you to have a little chat now. I'm going to try and finish on time today, or not run over too much anyway.